Why is STEAM so important today?
In John Maida's conversation and presentation, we learned, the power and impact potential of STEAM, an integrated approach to learning. There's been so much discussion around STEM, so much effort, so much funding around STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. But John so succinctly points out that the arts and design are really the seeds of creativity.
Or yes, if you're an engineer, you're truly creative. If you're a scientist, you're creative. If you're an artist and designer, you're creative, but also you can also make things in ways you didn't think you could make. So maybe by keeping those letters together, it creates more friction, where it's okay to be a hybrid, because universities, even K-12, I imagine, produces people who are not hybrids. You're told that you're not any good at what you do if you do one thing.
It's through the arts and design that students gain exposure and experience with problems that don't necessarily have right answers. There's no one right way to create a painting. There's no one right way to perform a piece of music. There are many possibilities. But by understanding that, by going through that process, working with others to create something, right, the students gain much greater facility with more open-ended problems. Mimi Ito gave a tremendous presentation on the enormous potential within connected learning, particularly connecting groups of interest, students interested in a particular area or topic, and then mentor-peer relationships that can be leveraged in those situations.
As educators, are we really looking at that whole spectrum of supports? And it's just too big a burden to put on the formal pipeline. It's too big a burden.
I think a lot of her work, not is just to highlight that inequity, but to find ways to overcome those gaps. So some of it is using technology to create groups, to connect groups of interest, let's say across the internet or using online media. Leah Beakley talked about STEM as culture. What does that mean?
We learned from Leah Beakley's talk a lot about sort of a new way of thinking how education has presented us these different learning pathways. STEM has been such an emphasis recently for a decade plus now, but only in a certain way. STEM as robotics, STEM as programming. Leah really brought to the fore this idea that STEM exists in all sorts of cultural manifestations, whether it's hip hop and the turntable technology that was developed to support that art form, the mathematics of crocheting, the geometry of pottery, showing that STEM, the core science, technology, engineering, math principles, can be found in a variety of forms. And we've only really focused on this very narrow notion of what STEM means in education in America.
There's all sorts of cultural practice, in particular, all sorts of making practices and subcultures and communities out there where what they do is like just incredibly rich with STEM content, and yet these many of these subcultures are largely invisible to us as STEMs.
Katrina Stevens proposed this idea, I think that captured it very succinctly, sort of a consumer reports for education technology, that we don't have a trusted source or a trusted entity to do education technology evaluations. Instead, what we have is a marketplace, and of course, with those who create new technologies with a really strong interest in selling those technologies, and then teachers and administrators who have immense needs for new tools and new technologies, but unsure of where to invest or how to invest.
So what if we designed a system where we were able to actually capture that information around context, so that every time a tool was used, we'd actually know all the things around how it was used, how it was implemented, what the experience of the teacher was, what the students were like, how much professional development did that teacher get?
So there's this enormous gap there, a knowledge gap that can be fulfilled. But I think Katrina did a great job of highlighting that this conversation needs to include those educators. That the procurement process right now is driven purely by administrators or often by information technologists, but including practitioners in that, including students in that. Oh my God, what a concept to actually include students in the choosing of the tools and platforms for their learning.
Chris Emden was an incredible opportunity to sort of feel a different way of how a classroom could be as a learner.
Let me tell you something. Respectability is the enemy of progressive pedagogy. Okay? The perception of what the rules of engagement are and allowing those rules to paralyze you is what inhibits you from growing.
His work brings into sharp relief the traditional approach to teaching, where you're going from a curriculum and you have to hit checkbox A, B, C, and D, to one that is, much more natural, much more authentic in how we actually interact as people, how students live their lives, what actually excites students about the world and learning about that world. There's so much learning innovation happening here in Philadelphia. It is one of the most innovative cities in terms of approaches to education, and yet sometimes we don't see it or we don't hear it. We don't sense it. We don't feel it. The reason for doing the Learning Innovation Conversation series was just to try to bring some of those voices, because sometimes we pay a little more attention when it's somebody from the outside. But the Learning Innovation Network is about activating those voices within Philadelphia. It's about giving a platform to those who are approaching learning in new ways, who are action-oriented people, who want change, who see the possibilities.